It was February 1988, and the Chicago Stadium was already electric 40 minutes before tip-off. The kind of electricity that doesn't come from anticipation alone, but from the specific tension that fills a building when two philosophies of basketball are about to collide in a way that will force one of them to be wrong. The Bulls were hosting the Detroit Pistons, and the Pistons were everything Chicago was not yet. Physical, organized, methodical, and completely without apology about any of it. Chuck Daly had spent 3 years building a machine specifically engineered to dismantle the kind of individual brilliance Michael Jordan represented, and the men he had assembled to run that machine were perfectly constructed for the job. Dennis Rodman, who made rebounding feel like a contact sport with no rules. Bill Laimbeer, who had turned the art of the hard foul into something approaching philosophy. Rick Mahorn, who communicated with opponents through their ribs. Joe Dumars, who was quiet and precise and more dangerous for both qualities. And Isaiah Thomas, who controlled the temperature of everything. The point guard who was the voice and the soul and the strategic center of a team that had elevated intimidation into a complete system of winning. Thomas was also, by the winter of 1988, one of the most respected players in the entire league. A two-time All-Star with a reputation that extended well beyond his statistics. A man who had taken Detroit from years of irrelevance into genuine championship contention through a combination of skill and will and an understanding of team basketball that coaches across the league cited openly as among the most sophisticated they had encountered. When Isaiah Thomas made a statement about the game, it carried weight. Which is exactly why what he chose to do during pregame warm-ups that night was so carefully calculated and so genuinely dangerous to the person it was directed at. He walked across the court to where Jordan was working through his shooting routine, and he spoke to him in front of reporters, in front of staff from both organizations, in front of teammates on both sides who were close enough to hear. And he spoke with the specific kind of condescension that is more damaging than open disrespect precisely because it doesn't give you anything direct to push back against. He told Jordan that his game was a marvel of individual brilliance, but that individual brilliance was, at its core, a sophisticated form of selfishness. That what Jordan produced night after night was extraordinary to observe, but structurally impossible to win with at the highest level. That scorers didn't win championships. Systems won championships. Teams won championships. And Jordan, Thomas said with the full authority of his standing and his experience and his credibility, was not a team player in any meaningful sense of the phrase. He delivered it almost gently, with the measured tone of a teacher correcting a talented student who has mastered the wrong lesson, and then he walked back to his own side of the floor as if nothing further needed to be said, as if the matter had been addressed and was now settled. The reporters nearby caught enough of it to understand what had just happened. The story moved through press row with the speed that only genuinely surprising things move. And the framing that emerged was not flattering to Jordan because Thomas was not offering noise or bravado. He was a credible voice making a credible argument in public, and the argument landed because it fit a conversation that was already happening around the Bulls. Jordan was 3 years into his career and had not won a single playoff series. The team around him existed largely because he existed, built by necessity rather than vision, and the gap between what Jordan could do individually and what the Bulls could do collectively was one of the defining tensions in the league that season. Thomas had taken that tension and made it specific and personal and public. The assessment that Jordan was individually spectacular but incapable of lifting a team to genuine championship contention was not an outrageous thing to say. It was the thing a reasonable, informed observer of the league might have said, which made it the most difficult kind of statement to dismiss and the most corrosive kind to carry. Jordan heard all of it. He took in every word with a quality of stillness that people who played alongside him or against him during those years would come to recognize as the most dangerous version of him that existed, not the animated Jordan, not the Jordan who talked back, not the visibly charged Jordan whose fire you could see burning in real time. The quiet one, the one who had gone somewhere interior and sealed the door behind him. Phil Jackson, who was in the organization at the time and had been studying Jordan with the attention of a man who understood that what he was watching was unprecedented, said years afterward that players who attempted to unsettle Jordan through conversation were always committing the same fundamental error. They were providing him material. They were placing into his hands something he could convert into energy, And Jordan's capacity for that conversion was without parallel among anyone Jackson had ever coached or observed. The words went in, and they did not come back out as defensiveness or distraction. They came back out as performance. Always as performance, and never before the moment when performance would do the most damage to the person who had provided the words in the first place. The game started, and the Pistons executed their identity with the precision of a team that had practiced cruelty until it became instinct. Laimbeer was trafficking in elbows. Rodman was consuming every missed shot before the Bulls could recover. Mahorn was making the lane feel like a place where you left something behind every time you entered it. It was the environment Thomas had described during warm-ups, a physical and systemic pressure designed specifically to expose individuals who needed the game to serve them, rather than the other way around. It was supposed to be the proof, the moment where everything Thomas had said in front of the reporters would be validated by what happened on the floor, where the hypothesis would be confirmed by the evidence of 48 minutes of real basketball against a real team that knew exactly how to take apart a player who put himself before the collective. Jordan scored 14 points in the first quarter, not in a burst, not in a performance, but in the quiet and deliberate way that a person scores points when they have already decided something and are now simply executing the decision. There was a quality to his movement that was different from what the Pistons had prepared for. A precision that carried within it something that looked, if you were paying close enough attention, almost like disdain. Not the theatrical disdain of a player trying to send a message through body language. The real kind. The kind that comes from a person who has been told what they cannot do and has already, internally, finished doing it. Every time a Pistons defender arrived at the position Jordan was supposed to occupy, Jordan had already left. Every time the physical pressure arrived to impose its logic on the game, Jordan had already found the angle that existed outside that logic. He was not navigating around the Pistons system. He was moving through it as if it were a condition of the environment rather than a force with the power to stop him. But the number that would appear in the box score the next morning was not the most important thing Jordan did that night, and this is where the story requires the kind of attention that statistics cannot demand on their own behalf. Jordan was making his teammates better in ways that were specific and intentional and visible to anyone watching with the right kind of focus. He was drawing defensive attention and finding the open man before the defense could recover. He was setting screens that created opportunities he wouldn't personally benefit from. He was talking on defense, organizing the people around him, operating as a communicating part of a collective structure, rather than a singular presence moving through 5 opponents. He was being a team player, genuinely and completely, not as a concession to criticism or a performance of virtue, but as a full expression of what he understood the game to actually require from the person most capable of determining its outcome. And he was doing all of this while also scoring at a rate that made the idea that individual excellence and collective commitment were opposing forces seem not just wrong but naive, a misunderstanding of what greatness at the highest level actually looked like when it was being practiced by someone who had fully understood it. The Bulls won the game. Jordan finished with 42 points, 9 assists, and 6 rebounds. In the post-game press conference, Thomas was composed and professional. He said Jordan had been exceptional. He said the Bulls had competed well as a team. He delivered the appropriate acknowledgments with the poise of a player who understood how these moments were supposed to be handled publicly. But every reporter in that room who had been present during the warm-up exchange understood the distance between what Thomas had predicted and what had just unfolded on the floor, and that distance was not a small one, and Thomas's composure at the podium did not fully close it. What Thomas said privately about that night emerged years later, in the kind of interview that becomes possible only after retirement has created enough distance from competition that honesty no longer carries a tactical cost. He said that what Jordan produced that night was one of the most complete responses to a direct challenge he had ever witnessed across his entire career in the game. He said Jordan had not simply scored points but had specifically addressed every element of the criticism, had taken each piece of what had been said during warm-ups and answered it within the structure of a single basketball game in a way that left no part of the argument standing. He said he had genuinely believed what he said before tip-off. He had looked at Jordan and seen a scorer of extraordinary gifts who had not yet made the transition into something a team could build a championship around. and he had believed that the Pistons' environment would surface that limitation in a way that would be plain to everyone watching. What Jordan showed him instead was that the transition had already been made, that the version of Jordan he had assessed was already out of date, that the framework he had applied was built for a player who no longer existed in the form he had assumed. He said he respected what Jordan did that night more than almost anything he had seen a player do in a game played against his own team, because it was a response that never sought validation through words, that found its expression entirely in the performance itself, in the only currency that basketball ultimately accepts. The dynamic between Jordan and Thomas across those years is one of the genuinely complex relationships in the history of the sport. They were not simply rivals. They were two competing answers to the same question about what a great player was supposed to look like and what winning was supposed to require. Thomas believed in the primacy of the system, in the idea that championship basketball demanded the subordination of individual impulse to collective design, and he had built his career and his team around that belief. Jordan believed in those same things, but not in a way that required individual greatness to be reduced in service of them. He believed that, at his level, individual greatness and collective success were not in tension, but in alignment, that the player who was most capable of determining a game's outcome and most committed to the team winning were not different players, but the same player operating with complete understanding of what the game demanded. The argument Thomas made during warm-ups was a real argument with real foundation behind it. Other players with gifts approaching Jordan's had allowed those gifts to function as a substitute for winning rather than a path toward it. Thomas was recognizing a known pattern and applying it to what he observed. He was wrong to apply it to Jordan, but understanding why he applied it and understanding what Jordan did in response to having it applied is where the actual meaning of that night lives. Jordan went on to win 6 championships across the following decade, constructing a body of work that rendered the question of whether he could be individually great and collectively essential feel almost historically strange in retrospect, feel like a question that should have been answered before it was seriously asked. But it was asked, publicly, by a credible voice, in front of witnesses, on a winter night before a game that Jordan proceeded to use as his answer. And the answer was not delivered in the press conference afterward, not in any interview, not in any conversation with any reporter or teammate or opponent. It was delivered in 42 points and 9 assists, and a Bulls victory over the most physically intimidating team in the Eastern Conference. It was delivered in the form that Jordan always used for the things that mattered most to him, not language, not expression, not anything that could be interpreted or argued with or revised. The game itself, the performance itself, the only answer he ever trusted to say what needed to be said. Because here's the thing about that night that only becomes fully visible with enough distance. Thomas giving Jordan that specific criticism in that specific public setting, in front of reporters who would write it down and frame it and circulate it before the game even started, was not something Jordan had to recover from. It was the thing Jordan needed most in that particular moment of his career. It was the most precise and credible articulation of the doubt that surrounded him, delivered by the most qualified voice available to deliver it, in a format that made it impossible to dismiss or minimize. It gave his preparation a target with a name and a face. It gave his performance a shape that went beyond the game itself. Without it, 42-9 is an extraordinary line in a regular season game in February. With it, 42-9 is a demolition of a specific argument made by a specific person in front of witnesses, which is not the same thing, and which is remembered differently, and which carries a different kind of permanence in the history of what that era of basketball meant. Isaiah Thomas told Michael Jordan publicly that he was not a team player, that individual brilliance could not produce championships, that what Jordan did was ultimately a beautiful and elaborate form of limitation. Jordan went out and scored 42 points with 9 assists, won the game, addressed every specific element of the criticism through the structure of the performance itself, and did it without a single word in response before or during or after. Thomas acknowledged it years later as among the most total answers to a challenge he had ever seen a player produce. That is the complete story. That is what it looks like when public humiliation meets someone who has understood that the only response worth giving is the one that makes the person who spoke regret the speaking, not through argument, not through confrontation, through the game. through the performance, through the only answer that outlasts everything else and that nobody who was in the building that night, and nobody who has heard the story since, has ever been able to find a reason to dispute.